The early morning sunlight slipped through the sheer white silk curtains and settled over the luxurious living room of the Blackwell estate on the outskirts of Chicago. It was one of the most expensive mansions in the region, its classic architecture blended with modern lines, a place where every small corner seemed to breathe power and wealth. Trenton Blackwell, a 36-year-old man with icy sharp eyes and an angular face, sat in his oversized leather sofa in the living room, scanning important documents for today's deal. He was the head of a vast business empire, and in the underworld, the name Trenton Blackwell made more than a few people tremble. But this morning, that cold face held a rare trace of a smile, because seated across from him was Veronica, his beautiful wife, her swollen, pregnant belly round and tight, already 8 months along. Veronica came to his side and gently placed a hot cup of coffee in front of him, her voice sweet as honey. She said she had brewed it with her own hands, and she wished him success in his upcoming negotiations. Trenton looked up at her, his gaze softening. He lifted a hand and lightly stroked her pregnant belly, feeling the life that was supposed to be growing inside. He told her that in only a few more weeks, they would meet their child. He was ready to be a father now. Veronica smiled, her eyes shining as if she were the happiest woman in the world. She said she couldn't wait any longer either. Standing quietly in the corner of the room, Rosalie Harper watched everything with an unreadable, expressionless face. The 27-year-old woman, brown hair neatly tied back and deep-set eyes, had served as the butler for the Blackwell family for 5 years. When Trenton bent over his papers again, Veronica flicked her gaze toward Rosalie, and it became something else entirely. Cold, contemptuous. She hissed through clenched teeth that Rosalie shouldn't stand there like a statue. She should go do something useful. Rosalie merely dipped her head, her voice calm as she answered, "Yes, Mrs. Blackwell." Trenton didn't hear a thing. He raised the coffee to his lips and took a long sip. The strong flavor spread across his tongue. He praised it as delicious, as always, and kept drinking. A few minutes passed. Then, suddenly, Trenton felt the room spin. His vision blurred, the world around him smearing at the edges. He called his wife's name in a weak voice and said something was wrong. The cup slipped from his hand and coffee spilled across the rug. Trenton reached toward Veronica, but his body no longer obeyed him. He slumped in his sofa, his eyes slowly closing. The room fell into silence. Veronica stood motionless for a few seconds, staring at her husband, lying unconscious. Then, all at once, she let out a breath of relief. The gentle smile vanished from her lips, replaced by a chilling, stone-cold expression. She muttered that it was finally over, that she couldn't stand another day of having to listen to those ridiculous words of love. She turned to Rosalie, her voice clipped with command. She told Rosalie to come help her take this thing off. It itched, and it was driving her crazy. Rosalie stepped forward, her hands reaching behind Veronica's back to pull a fastening cord, and then the round, pregnant belly dropped to the floor with a dull, heavy thud. It wasn't a baby. It was only a finely crafted block of silicone, a prop in the perfect performance Veronica had staged for 8 months. Veronica kicked the fake belly aside and stretched with satisfaction. She said that 8 months of wearing that hateful thing, 8 months of pretending to love that stupid man, had all been for his money. She glanced down at Trenton lying still, not a shred of pity in her eyes. She told Rosalie to deal with him, because she still had to meet Derek to sign the inheritance papers. When everything was finished, she would have it all. Money, property, power. And Trenton Blackwell would be left with nothing. Veronica grabbed her designer handbag and checked her reflection as she fixed her hair. She reminded Rosalie to put the fake belly back on her before she went out, because she couldn't let anyone see her with a flat stomach. Rosalie silently did as she was told. The false belly was secured back into place, turning Veronica once again into a blissful, expectant mother. Veronica walked out the door, her high heels striking the marble floor in a hard, merciless rhythm. She didn't look back even once at the husband lying unconscious in his sofa. The door closed. The mansion sank into silence. Rosalie stood beside Trenton, looking down at him with eyes that revealed nothing. And then, what no one expected happened. On the sofa, Trenton Blackwell's eyes slowly opened. He had heard everything. Every word. Every plot. Every cruel truth. The wife he loved had never been pregnant. The child he had been waiting for had never existed. It had all been a performance, and he was the only fool who had believed it. But Veronica didn't know she had just made a deadly mistake, because Trenton Blackwell wasn't a man who could be defeated so easily. And when a mafia boss is betrayed, the consequences won't stop at losing money. If you want to know how Trenton will take revenge, and what Veronica's fate will be. Please like this video to support us. Don't forget to share the story with your friends and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next dramatic developments. The sound of Veronica's engine drifted farther and farther away until it vanished completely. The mansion returned to a silence so complete it felt like it could swallow breath. Rosalie stood by the window, watching the red sports car disappear behind a row of ancient oak trees. She waited a few more seconds to be certain that woman was truly gone. Then she turned back toward the living room with hurried steps. She moved to the sofa where Trenton still lay motionless, her voice gentle but clear. She called his name and told him Veronica had left, that he could get up now. Trenton's eyes opened fully. He sat up slowly, lifting a hand to rub at his temples and chase away what remained of the dizziness. The mild sleeping drug still left his head a little fogged, but his mind was sharp in a way that hurt. Veronica's words still rang in his ears. 8 months of pretending. A child that didn't exist. All for money. He looked at Rosalie, the woman who had silently saved his life by replacing a lethal dose of sedative with ordinary sleeping medicine. He asked her why she hadn't told him sooner. Rosalie said she had tried, many times, but he didn't believe her. Trenton fell silent. Memories rushed back like floodwater. He remembered the times Rosalie had tried to hint, the worried looks she gave him whenever Veronica was too sweet, the half-finished sentences he always brushed aside because he assumed she was jealous or mistaken. He had been too blind. He had trusted the woman he called his wife far too much, and he had ignored the only person who truly cared whether he lived. Trenton looked at Rosalie with an expression that tangled into something complicated. Their relationship wasn't as simple as employer and household staff. It had begun 5 years earlier, on one of the darkest nights of that young woman's life. Back then, Trenton had been investigating the illegal operations of Franco Ricci, a rival mafia boss and a business adversary. During surveillance, he discovered Franco wasn't only smuggling goods, he was also running a large-scale human trafficking ring. Young women were abducted, sold like merchandise, stripped of dignity and freedom. Trenton had coordinated with the FBI to bring the operation down, and among the victims rescued that night was a 22-year-old woman with hollow eyes and a body made thin by starvation. That girl was Rosalie Harper. After the case ended, Rosalie stood at a crossroads with nowhere to go. Her family was gone. She couldn't return to her hometown. The past had taken everything she'd ever had. Trenton saw the lostness in her eyes and made her an offer. He needed a butler for his estate. Steady work, good pay, and most important, a safe place for her to begin again. Rosalie accepted. Over the past 5 years, she worked with professionalism and devotion no one could criticize. She never spoke of the past, never demanded anything beyond the limits of her duty, but deep inside, she carried one truth like a vow. Trenton Blackwell was the man who had given her a second life, and she would never allow anyone to take his life away. Rosalie met Trenton's eyes directly, her voice slow but steady. She said he had given her a new life. She couldn't let anyone take his life from him. Trenton felt his throat tighten. He had poured love and trust into a woman who saw him as nothing more than a walking cash machine. Meanwhile, the person who was truly willing to protect him was the woman he had never really seen. He thanked her, his voice dropping low. Rosalie shook her head slightly and said he didn't need to thank her. But there was something else he needed to know. It was about Derek. Trenton's brow tightened, his gaze turning icy at the sound of that name. Derek Lawson was his personal attorney, the man he had trusted with every legal matter for years. He asked Rosalie what was going on with Derek. Rosalie drew a long breath before she answered that Derek wasn't only Veronica's accomplice. He was something else as well, and what she was about to say would hurt him even more than what he had just heard. Rosalie hesitated for a brief moment, then continued. She said Derek wasn't simply an accomplice helping Veronica forge documents. He was her lover. They'd been together for years, long before Veronica ever appeared in Trenton's life. Nothing that happened was accidental. It was a plot, carefully calculated from the beginning. Veronica approached Trenton by following a script that had already been written. She studied him, his family, his longing for a child, and she used every bit of it. Trenton was only the target. Easy money. A rich piece of prey those two con artists had set their sights on. Trenton felt as if someone had driven a hard fist straight into his chest. He sank down into the sofa, both hands gripping his head. Images from the past surged forward like a slow-motion film, each frame soaked in pain. He remembered the first time he met Veronica at a charity gala, how beautiful and graceful she was, how her smile made his heart melt. He remembered the night he proposed under the moonlight, her eyes shining as she accepted the diamond ring. He remembered their wedding day, when she walked down the aisle in a pure white gown, and he truly believed he was the luckiest man on earth. And he remembered the day she ran into his arms, sobbing as she told him she was pregnant. He had been so happy he couldn't even speak. He'd ordered the white crib she wanted right away, the nursery decorated with toys and newborn clothes, everything ready. He had been prepared to become a father. He had loved her with everything in him. Trenton's voice shook as he said he had loved her for real. He'd bought the white crib she wanted. He'd prepared everything to welcome their child. He'd been ready to be a father. Rosalie stood in silence, watching the most powerful man in Chicago collapse in front of her. She understood this kind of pain. Not the pain of losing money or being cheated out of possessions, but the pain of a heart betrayed, of love trampled, of faith stabbed from behind by the very person you loved most. She spoke softly, her voice gentle but sincere. She said, "Some people don't deserve the love you give them." Trenton lifted his head, his eyes rimmed red. He suddenly thought of his parents. Harold and Margaret were close to 70. They loved him without conditions, and they'd been yearning to hold a grandson for so long. Every time they visited, his mother would rub Veronica's belly with such hopeful eyes. How devastated they'd be when they learned the truth. He told Rosalie he was worried about his parents. They'd been waiting for this grandchild for so long. Rosalie looked at him for a moment, then sighed. She said, in fact, they already knew. They'd suspected Veronica for months. They had warned him, but he refused to listen. So they asked Rosalie to quietly gather evidence. Trenton froze. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. His parents and Rosalie had been working together all this time, and he hadn't known a thing. While he'd been blindly trusting a betraying wife, the people who truly loved him had been silently protecting him from behind. He felt ashamed and grateful at once. Ashamed that he hadn't believed his parents' warnings. Grateful that they still hadn't abandoned him, even when he'd been that stubborn. Trenton stood, drew a deep breath. The pain was still there, but now it was beginning to transform into something else. Rage, resolve. He asked Rosalie what they should do now. Rosalie looked at him, a cold glint flashing in her eyes. She said they would make Veronica taste the very medicine she had used. Trenton pulled out his phone and dialed Bennett Cole. After only 2 rings, the warm, steady voice of his loyal bodyguard came through on the other end. Trenton kept it brief, saying he needed Bennett at the estate immediately, and to bring everything he had. Bennett said he'd be there in 15 minutes. True to his word, 15 minutes later, Bennett's black car rolled to a stop in front of the doors. The 38-year-old man, broad-shouldered with a sharp, watchful gaze, strode into the living room carrying a leather briefcase. Bennett had worked for Trenton for 10 years, from the days when he was a young guard to the moment he became the most dependable right hand his boss had. No long explanation was needed. The moment Bennett saw Trenton's face, he understood what was happening. He set the briefcase on the table and opened it, revealing a laptop and thick folders of documents. Bennett reported that he had everything. The phone calls between Veronica and Derek had been recorded. Their meetings at hotels were captured in photos and video. Their conversations about money, about the plan to seize the assets, about how they'd divide everything after Trenton died. All of it had been preserved with chilling clarity. Trenton flipped through page after page, studied photograph after photograph. Each image was a blade, driven straight into his heart. Veronica and Derek wrapped around each other in a hotel room. Veronica kissing Derek with hungry abandon on the very bed she'd claimed belonged to a business trip, the two of them laughing as they talked about how they'd spend his money. He closed the folder, his voice turning to ice, and said it was enough. Now they needed a plan. Rosalie stepped closer and suggested they let Veronica expose herself. Veronica still believed Rosalie was on her side, and they could use that. Trenton thought for a moment, then nodded. He told Rosalie to prepare a special cup of coffee, using the same mild sleeping medicine she'd used this morning to replace the deadly drug meant to knock him out for good. When Veronica returned, they'd make her taste the very weapon she'd planned to use against him. Rosalie nodded and went into the kitchen to get it ready. Trenton turned to Bennett, a dangerous light flashing in his eyes, and said Veronica loved drama, so they'd give her a stage. Bennett smiled in a way that carried meaning all its own, and said he'd arrange everything. Then Bennett paused, his expression shifting as he looked at Trenton with something unusual in his gaze. He said he'd worked for Trenton for 10 years, and in all that time, he'd never once seen Trenton look at anyone the way he looked at Rosalie. Trenton didn't answer. He gave no response to Bennett's remark, but his eyes wavered for the briefest moment. He turned his head toward the kitchen, where Rosalie was carefully preparing the coffee. She'd been by his side for 5 years, quiet and devoted. She'd saved his life without asking for anything. She'd stayed loyal even when he refused to believe her. All while the wife he'd loved had been trying to kill him to steal what was his. A strange, sharp feeling tightened in Trenton's chest, something he couldn't quite name. At that exact moment, the ring of a phone shattered the hush. Rosalie took her phone from her pocket, glanced at the screen, then looked at Trenton with a knowing expression. She said Veronica was calling. Trenton nodded, signaling for her to answer. The performance was about to begin. Meanwhile, at Derek Lawson's law office in downtown Chicago, a completely different scene was unfolding. The room was lavishly decorated, its walls crowded with awards and professional certificates, a polished display of credibility built to cloak a professional con artist. Veronica sat on a brown leather sofa, the fake belly still strapped to her body. She'd arrived only minutes earlier, and Derek had already closed the office door so they could speak in private. The instant the door shut, Veronica threw herself into Derek's arms, holding him tight with a radiant smile. She said they'd finally done it. 8 months of waiting, 8 months of acting, and now everything was about to belong to them. Derek kissed her forehead, then led her to his desk. He opened a briefcase and took out a thick stack of papers. It was the will he'd prepared in advance, complete with Trenton's forged signature. He explained that under this will, Veronica and the child in her womb would inherit everything: the company, the real estate, the bank accounts, the inheritance from Trenton's parents. All of it would be theirs. Veronica flipped through page after page, her eyes lighting up with greed, but then her brow tightened with sudden worry. She asked Derek what they'd do if Trenton's parents wanted to see the baby. Harold and Margaret had been longing for this child, and they wouldn't easily accept it if they couldn't lay eyes on their grandson. Derek gave a short, mocking laugh and patted her hand to reassure her. He said not to worry. He'd already thought of that. He pulled out another sheet from the briefcase. It was a death certificate, already prepared, needing only a date to be filled in. The plan was simple. A few months after Trenton died in an accident, the baby would die too. Premature birth, complications, or any medical reason at all. Veronica would play the role of a grieving widow who'd lost both husband and child. No one would suspect a thing. No one would ask questions. And she'd inherit everything without having to share with anyone. Veronica looked at Derek with admiration and said he really was a genius. That was why she loved him. They held each other and laughed with smug satisfaction, as if victory were already secured in their hands. Years of planning, approaching Trenton, pretending to love him, wearing that itchy, unbearable fake belly. It was all about to be rewarded. But just as they were savoring their triumph, Veronica's phone suddenly rang. She looked at the screen and saw Rosalie's name. She answered with irritation, ready to curse the maid for daring to disturb her at a moment like this. But Rosalie's panicked voice on the other end made her freeze where she sat. Rosalie said something was wrong. Trenton had woken up. Veronica felt as if lightning had struck her ears. She screamed, demanding to know what Rosalie had just said. Rosalie repeated that Trenton was awake. She didn't know what had happened, but he'd opened his eyes. Veronica flew into a rage and shouted into the phone. She called Rosalie useless. She'd given clear instructions about the dosage, so how could Rosalie have ruined it like this? Derek snatched the phone from Veronica's hand, forcing himself to stay calm. He asked Rosalie whether Trenton had said anything, whether he seemed suspicious. Rosalie said she didn't know. He'd only complained of a headache and gone to lie down. She hadn't dared ask much, afraid it would look suspicious. Derek let out a breath of relief. He reassured Veronica that Trenton might simply not have drunk enough. She needed to stay calm, go home, and act normal, play the worried wife caring for her husband. They'd find another way afterward. Veronica drew a deep breath, forcing herself to regain control. She nodded at Derek, then hurried out of the office. Her red sports car shot through the streets of Chicago, toward the Blackwell estate. On the way, she kept adjusting the fake belly and rehearsing a worried expression in the rearview mirror. She had no idea she was driving straight into a trap that had already been set, and the people she thought were allies had now taken the enemy's side. Veronica's red sports car rolled to a hard stop in front of the gates of the Blackwell estate. She shut off the engine, but she didn't get out right away. Instead, she sat there for a moment, gathering herself. First, she checked the fake belly again, making sure it was strapped on firmly and still looked natural. Then she flipped down the rearview mirror to study her face. Her makeup was still intact, but she still pulled out her lipstick and freshened her mouth to make herself look a little brighter, a little more alive. She adjusted her hair, smoothing down the strands the wind had mussed. Then she drew a deep breath, closed her eyes and focused on the role she was about to play. She was Veronica Blackwell, the loving wife, frantic with fear because her husband had fainted. She had to be shaken. She had to be attentive. She had to show terror at the thought that something might have happened to the man she loved. When she opened her eyes, she looked straight into the mirror and saw a woman staring back with eyes full of worry. Perfect. She was ready. Veronica stepped out of the car and hurried toward the front door. She deliberately made her pace faster than usual, as if she were racing against time to get back to her husband's side. The heavy doors opened, and she rushed inside, her voice ringing out with practiced panic. She called her husband's name, saying she'd heard he'd fainted, asking if he was all right, insisting she was so worried she could hardly breathe. But the scene in the living room stopped her in her tracks. The room was darker than usual. The curtains had been drawn halfway, allowing only a few weak shafts of light to slip in. Trenton sat on the sofa in the center of the room, his face strangely calm. He didn't look like a man who'd just passed out and was still suffering for it. Instead, his eyes were cold as ice, fixed straight on her. In the corner of the room, Bennett stood with his arms folded across his chest. This loyal bodyguard usually appeared only when something serious was happening, and his gaze didn't leave Veronica for even a second. Veronica felt it at once. Something was wrong. The air in the room was heavy, almost suffocating. She forced herself to keep the worried expression in place as she moved closer to Trenton. She asked if he was feeling better, said she'd driven back as fast as she could when Rosalie called with the news. Trenton didn't rise to greet her the way he always did. He only watched her with an unreadable look and said he was fine. He told her to sit down, because they needed to talk. Veronica sat in the sofa across from him, fighting to keep her face from showing the unease creeping under her skin. Why was Trenton so calm? Why was Bennett here? Why did the room feel tight with tension? Just then, Rosalie entered from the kitchen. She carried a silver tray with 2 steaming cups of coffee. She set the tray on the table, then stepped back, her voice polite as she asked Veronica whether she'd like coffee. Trenton reached for 1 cup and pushed the other toward Veronica. He told her to drink. Rosalie had just made it. Veronica stared at the cup in front of her. Thin steam rose and curled through the air. The familiar scent of freshly roasted coffee spread through the room, but instead of desire, she felt a chill slide down her spine. This cup looked exactly like the cup she'd handed Trenton that morning. Her hands began to tremble, just slightly at first. Veronica looked at the cup of coffee and shook her head, her voice working hard to sound natural. She said she wasn't thirsty. Trenton lifted an eyebrow, tilting his head slightly to the side, as if he were studying prey trying to slip out of a snare. He asked if that was so, whether she didn't trust Rosalie's coffee, or whether she knew what was in it. Veronica felt her heart miss a beat. She forced her face to stay smooth, her mouth stretching into a strained little smile. She asked Trenton what he was talking about. She simply didn't want coffee right now, that was all. Trenton rose from the sofa and started toward her, moving slowly. Each step sounded steady against the wooden floor, and the rhythm felt like the countdown of a bomb about to detonate. The distance between them kept shrinking. Veronica wanted to step back, but her feet felt nailed to the floor. Trenton stopped directly in front of her, his icy eyes looking down. He said, "Then prove it. Drink this cup of coffee and prove you have nothing to hide." Veronica swallowed. She understood it was a test. If she refused to drink, it would be evidence that she knew something was in the coffee. And if she knew, that meant she was the one who'd drugged Trenton's coffee that morning. But what if she drank? Rosalie had called to say the plan had failed. Was that Maid truly on her side? Or was this a trap? Veronica flicked a glance at Rosalie, standing silently in the corner. Rosalie's face revealed no emotion at all, no signal that she was trying to communicate anything. Veronica made her decision in a heartbeat. She had to gamble. If she refused, she'd lose for certain. But if she drank, maybe Rosalie was still loyal and the coffee was completely normal. She'd prove her innocence, and Trenton would have no reason left to suspect her. Veronica drew a deep breath and picked up the cup. She stared straight into Trenton's eyes with a look of defiance, then lifted it to her lips and took a long drink. She set the cup down and said, "There." Was he satisfied now? Trenton didn't answer. He only stood there and watched her with a cold gaze, as if he were waiting for something. 1 minute passed. 2. Veronica began to feel relief loosening the tightness in her chest. Maybe Rosalie really was still on her side. Maybe she'd been worrying for nothing. But then, in the 3rd minute, everything began to change. Veronica's head suddenly felt heavy, as if it were filling with stone. The room around her started to spin. She tried to stand, but her legs no longer obeyed her. She grabbed the edge of the sofa, her voice weak as she asked what Trenton had done to her. Trenton remained unmoving, watching her without a shred of pity. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Veronica's vision dimmed. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was the cold smile on Rosalie's lips, the girl she'd thought was an ally, the girl she'd ordered to poison Trenton. It turned out that from the very beginning, Rosalie had never been on her side. Veronica slumped unconscious in the sofa. When Veronica woke up, she didn't know how long she'd been out. Her head still rang, and her eyes took a few seconds to adjust to the light. The first thing she realized was that she was sitting in a different sofa, her hands tied behind her back. The second thing that made her go numb was the fake belly lying discarded on the floor right in front of her. She lowered her gaze to her stomach and saw it was flat. 8 months of disguise had been stripped away completely. Veronica lifted her head and saw Bennett standing beside her, a phone in his hand. From that phone came the familiar voices of her and Derek. It was their conversation at the law office, when they talked about the forged will, about the plan to kill Trenton, about the death certificate for a baby that didn't exist. Every word played back with brutal clarity, detail by detail. Veronica felt the blood in her veins turn to ice. They knew. They knew everything. Trenton sat on the sofa across from her, one leg crossed over the other, one hand resting on the arm of the couch. He looked at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Not the sweet affection he'd always given her, not the blind trust she'd exploited for so long. It was the gaze of a Mafia boss staring at a traitor, cold, cruel, without a hint of mercy. Trenton spoke, his voice low and even, as if he were talking about the weather rather than the fact that his wife had just plotted to kill him for his fortune. He said he'd heard everything, Veronica, every single word. The recording stopped. The room sank into a terrifying silence. Trenton tilted his head slightly, studying Veronica with a performance of false curiosity. He asked if she had anything she wanted to say now. Veronica swept her gaze around the room, at the fake belly lying discarded on the floor, at Bennett holding the phone with the recording of her guilt, at Rosalie standing in silence with that cold, steady look, and finally at Trenton, waiting for her answer. She understood it was over. There was no way left to deny it, no reason left to keep acting, and if she couldn't hold the mask in place anymore, then she didn't need to pretend at all. The gentle, lovable face Veronica had worn for 2 years vanished in an instant. In its place was a hard, twisted expression, warped by fury and resentment. She lifted her chin, staring straight into Trenton's eyes with open hostility. She asked if he thought she wanted to live with a Mafia man, waking up every day afraid that today might be the day someone put a bullet in his head, living every day with a smile she had to fake, knowing his enemies could appear at any moment. She was sick of that life. She'd only wanted his money. She had never wanted him. Trenton didn't look surprised by Veronica's sudden transformation. Maybe he'd guessed long ago that behind the sweetness was a venomous snake. He just hadn't wanted to believe it. But now, seeing the real face of the woman he had once loved, he felt only disgust. Veronica turned on Rosalie, her eyes bloodshot with rage. She screamed, demanding to know why Rosalie had betrayed her when she'd promised her money. She'd been going to give her enough to live in luxury for the rest of her life. So what had she betrayed her for? For him. For a cold-blooded Mafia man. Rosalie didn't move, didn't flinch under Veronica's fury. She looked at the woman shrieking in front of her with a calm gaze that even carried a hint of pity. She said no amount of money could buy her conscience, Mrs. Ashford. Veronica jerked as if she'd been shocked. Ashford. That was her maiden name, the name she'd left behind when she married Trenton and became Mrs. Blackwell. Hearing Rosalie use it wasn't merely a form of address. It was a stripping away of status, a declaration that she wasn't Trenton's wife anymore. She didn't belong to the Blackwell family anymore. She was only Veronica Ashford, a failed con artist. Trenton stood and walked to a stop in front of her. He said every account had been frozen. The prenuptial agreement she'd signed before the wedding had protected all of his assets. She would get nothing, not a single cent. Veronica let out a cold laugh, her voice bitter. She asked if he thought he'd won, if he thought he could throw her out like a dog and she'd accept it in silence. He was dreaming. Trenton didn't bother to answer. He turned to Bennett and ordered him to get her out of his house. Bennett nodded, stepped forward, and clamped a firm hand around Veronica's arm. He hauled her to her feet without much gentleness. Veronica fought, trying to wrench herself free, but her strength was nothing against the solid power of the bodyguard. She was dragged toward the door, her high heels scraping the wooden floor with a harsh, screeching sound. Near the doorway, Veronica suddenly twisted her head back, her face contorted with hatred. She screamed that Trenton would regret this. She swore he would pay. He, and that disgusting little servant girl too. They would pay for what they'd done to her today. Trenton stood still, watching as his former wife was pulled out. He showed no fear at her threats. He'd faced enemies far more dangerous than Veronica many times in his life. A greedy, defeated woman couldn't make him tremble. The door slammed shut behind Veronica. The mansion returned to quiet, but both Trenton and Rosalie knew this wasn't the end. Veronica's threat wasn't just empty words spat out in anger. A woman who dared to plot her husband's death for his fortune wouldn't give up easily when cornered. She would find a way to take revenge. And when someone with nothing left decides to strike back, that's when they become the most dangerous. Bennett shoved Veronica out through the Blackwell estate gates, then slammed them shut in her face. Veronica stood rooted on the sidewalk, staring back at the magnificent mansion that only a few hours earlier she'd believed would be hers. Now she had nothing but the clothes on her body. No handbag, no phone, no money, no car. Everything she'd had inside that house had been bought with Trenton's money, and he'd kept it all. She didn't even have the fake belly she'd worn for 8 months. She stood there for a long time, letting the late afternoon wind whip through her tangled hair. Then she started walking, not even knowing where she was going. In the end, she stopped at a bus station and begged a ride from a stranger just to reach Derek's apartment in a working-class neighborhood on the south side of the city. By the time Veronica knocked on Derek's door, she'd braced herself to face him and plan their next move together, but she had no idea things were far worse than she'd imagined. Derek opened the door with a face drained of color. His eyes were bloodshot, his hair a mess, his clothes wrinkled as if he hadn't slept for hours. He yanked Veronica inside, slammed the door, and immediately started shouting. He said they were investigating him. The Illinois State Bar had received a complete file on his illegal dealings, including the forged will for Veronica. His law license had been suspended. The police had also called, ordering him to come to the station to give a statement. It was all Veronica's fault. Veronica stared at him, wide-eyed, unable to believe what she was hearing. She screamed back that it was her fault. He was the one who'd said the plan was perfect. He was the one who'd assured her no one could ever uncover it. He was the lawyer, the one who understood the law, the one who'd planned everything, and now he was blaming her. Derek shouted that he'd never expected Trenton to have someone watching them. He'd never expected that maid to betray Veronica. He'd never expected everything to collapse so fast. They fought loudly in the cramped apartment, hurling accusations, cursing each other, tearing into one another. Two accomplices, now snapping at each other like two dogs fighting over the last scrap of bone. Finally, Derek stopped, breathing hard. He said he had to leave the city. He had a little money saved, enough to buy a plane ticket to Mexico or Canada. He would disappear before the police could arrest him. Veronica looked at him as if she couldn't believe her eyes. She asked if he was going to leave her behind. After everything they'd been through together, after all the promises about the future, was he going to run alone and leave her here to face the consequences? Derek avoided her eyes, silent. That silence was an answer clearer than any words. Veronica gave a cold laugh. She stepped closer to Derek, her voice dropping into something low and threatening. She said if he dared to leave her now, she would tell the police everything. She would say he was the mastermind, that he forced her into it, that he was the one who planned Trenton's murder. He wouldn't just lose his license. He'd spend the rest of his life in prison. Derek went rigid. He looked at Veronica the way you look at a venomous snake. He knew she wasn't joking. She was the kind of woman who would do anything to get what she wanted, even drag him down into hell with her if she had to. He let out a long breath and dropped into a sofa, knowing he was bound to this woman now and there was no escape. Veronica sat down across from him, her mind spinning. She had no money, no power, nothing she could use to fight Trenton. But she wouldn't accept defeat. She wouldn't accept being thrown onto the street like a stray dog, while Trenton and that hateful maid lived in comfort in the mansion that should have been hers. Then, suddenly, a name flashed through her mind. A name she'd once heard Trenton mention in a conversation with Bennett, when he thought she was asleep. Franco Ricci. Veronica murmured the name, her eyes lighting with a new spark of hope. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. It took Veronica 2 days to find a way to contact Franco Ricci. She had to pass through multiple layers of middlemen, meeting suspicious brokers in dark alleyways and damp bars on the south side of Chicago. In the end, she finally received an address and a time. It was a small Italian restaurant tucked away on a quiet street, ordinary on the outside. But inside it was the lair of one of the most dangerous mafia bosses in the city. Franco Ricci was Trenton Blackwell's sworn enemy. 5 years earlier, he had run a large-scale human trafficking ring, bringing young women from everywhere to sell to men with money. It was an underground empire that brought him millions of dollars every year. But Trenton discovered it and worked with the FBI to destroy the entire operation. Franco lost everything. Money, power, his name in the underworld. He had to stay on the run for 2 years before he could come back and rebuild from the ground up. His hatred for Trenton Blackwell had never cooled, not for a single day. When Veronica stepped into the restaurant, 2 huge guards stopped her and searched her thoroughly before allowing her into the back room. Franco Ricci sat at a round table near the far end of the room, surrounded by 4 or 5 men who looked vicious enough to make the air feel sharper. He was a man around 45, salt and pepper hair combed back, eyes as sharp as knives. When he saw Veronica, he raised an eyebrow with clear curiosity. He asked if she was Blackwell's wife, or rather his ex-wife. Veronica took the sofa across from him, showing no fear, even though she knew that with a single nod from Franco, she could disappear from the earth forever. She said Trenton had ruined her. She wanted revenge, and she had information he needed. Franco gave a short, skeptical laugh. He'd lived in the underworld long enough to know he shouldn't trust anyone, especially a woman who'd just been thrown out by her husband and was desperate to strike back. He asked why he should believe her. For all he knew, this was nothing but a trap Trenton had set to lure him into one mistake. Veronica smiled and began to tell Franco about Trenton's business structure, about subsidiaries, secret bank accounts, shadowy deals she'd overheard during 2 years as his wife. She told him about the Blackwell estate's security system, about the number of guards, patrol schedules, weak points in the defensive perimeter. She told him about Trenton's daily habits, the places he often went, the times he was alone and easiest to attack. Franco listened closely, his eyes slowly brightening with every detail Veronica revealed. But he still wasn't completely convinced. He said the information was useful, but Trenton Blackwell wasn't a man who could be taken down easily. He had his own army, money, power. To bring down someone like that, they'd need something more special than this. Veronica nodded, knowing this was the moment to play her trump card. She said there was one person Trenton cared about more than anything else in the world. His house manager, Rosalie Harper. She was Trenton's fatal weakness. If he wanted to destroy him, he should aim at that girl. Franco suddenly sat up straighter, his eyes flashing with a dangerous spark when he heard the familiar name. He murmured Rosalie Harper, the girl who had testified against him in court 5 years ago. Her testimony had sent many of his men to prison and forced him to run like a rat. He'd always wanted to find her for revenge, but she'd vanished without a trace after the trial. So all this time, she'd been right under Trenton Blackwell's nose. How interesting. Veronica smiled in triumph when she saw Franco's reaction. She knew she'd hit the right spot. They talked a little longer and finally reached an agreement. Veronica would keep providing information about Trenton. She'd act as Franco's inside source. In return, he'd give her money and protection. When Trenton was brought down, she'd receive a portion of his assets as her reward. Franco nodded his agreement, then turned to one of the men standing behind him. He ordered him to have someone follow that house manager girl, record everything she did, and wait for the right moment. 2 months passed since the day Veronica was thrown out of the Blackwell estate. Life gradually slipped back into its usual rhythm, as if the nightmare named Veronica Ashford had never happened at all. The mansion remained grand and gleaming. The garden still bloomed beneath the spring sun, and birdsong still rose every morning. But there was one thing that had changed, something no one ever said out loud. The relationship between Trenton and Rosalie. The line between owner and staff seemed to blur a little more each day. Trenton no longer called Rosalie the house manager. He called her Rose, a name so intimate only the people closest to you are allowed to use it. They fell into the habit of talking every evening after dinner. Sometimes it was out on the balcony overlooking the garden. Sometimes it was in the living room beside the unsteady glow of the fireplace. Trenton asked Rosalie about her life, about who she had been before the abduction, about the family she had lost, about the dreams she once carried. Rosalie told him about her childhood in a small town, about the mother who died when she was still young, about a dream of traveling around the world she had never been given the chance to live out. Trenton listened to every word with a focus he had never offered anyone before. One afternoon, Trenton called Rosalie into his office. She stepped in with a nervous look, unsure what she might have done wrong. But Trenton only smiled and handed her a small box wrapped in black velvet. Rosalie opened it and found a simple silver bracelet inside, its surface engraved with delicate rose patterns. Trenton said it wasn't anything expensive or extravagant, but he wanted her to wear it. He felt calmer knowing she was always safe. Rosalie didn't know that inside the bracelet there was a tiny tracking chip. It was one of Trenton's habits, his way of protecting the people who mattered to him in an underworld filled with danger. Rosalie slipped the bracelet onto her wrist and studied it under the light. She said she would never take it off. Her eyes shimmered as she looked at Trenton, and in that moment, they both felt something shifting between them. That weekend, Harold and Margaret Blackwell came to visit their son. They were close to 70, but still sharp and strong. They were happy to see Trenton free from Veronica's claws, and they could tell he was slowly recovering from the emotional blow. But what made them happiest was their son's attitude toward Rosalie. Margaret watched the way Trenton looked at Rosalie whenever she entered the room, the way he smiled when he heard her speak, the way he always found a reason to be near her. She pulled her son aside and whispered that she'd seen how he looked at that girl. "Don't let this one slip away the way you once let someone else deceive you." Trenton shook his head and said his mother was mistaken. Rose was only the house manager. Margaret only gave him a knowing smile and said nothing more. She had lived long enough to recognize love in her son's face, no matter how much he denied it. Margaret wasn't the only one who saw it. Bennett, the bodyguard who had been with Trenton for 10 years, also noticed the change in his boss. One night, as the two of them sat in the office reviewing security reports, Bennett spoke up. He said he'd worked for Trenton for 10 years, and he'd never seen his boss like this before. Trenton looked up and asked what he meant, like this. Bennett only smiled in that secretive way, and didn't answer. That night, Trenton lay in bed and couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Rosalie, about her smile, her eyes, the warmth he felt whenever she was near. He wondered if what his mother and Bennett had said was true. Was he really falling in love with that girl? The next morning, Bennett came to see Trenton with a grave expression. He reported that Veronica had vanished completely 2 months earlier. No one knew where she was. There wasn't a single trace. Derek Lawson had also fled the city. Bennett said he had a very bad feeling about it. That night arrived like a nightmare with no warning. Trenton was sitting in his office reviewing business documents when, without a sound, every light in the mansion cut out at once. Darkness poured into every corner. He shot to his feet, the instincts of a man who'd survived in the underworld for years snapping into sharp alertness. Then glass began to shatter. From everywhere at once. The living room windows, the kitchen windows, the glass doors at the back of the garden, all of them smashed simultaneously. Footsteps thundered, orders were shouted. Gunfire cracked through the dark. The Blackwell estate was under attack. Trenton burst out of the office with the handgun he always kept in his desk drawer. The scene in front of him looked like an action film brought to life. Men dressed in black with their faces covered were flooding in from every direction. His security team was fighting them, but they were clearly outnumbered. This wasn't an ordinary robbery. This was a coordinated assault, planned in advance. Trenton recognized it immediately. These were Franco Ricci's men. He fired at 2 attackers rushing him, dropping them before they could react. But another man came at him from behind. They grappled in the darkness. Trenton drove a fist into the man's face, but the man stabbed him hard in the shoulder. The pain tore through him and made him stagger, but he still managed to end it with a brutal punch to the attacker's temple. Blood soaked his sleeve, but he had no time to worry about the wound. He had to find Rosalie. On the other side of the mansion, Bennett was fighting like a lion to protect Harold and Margaret. The elderly couple trembled in a corner, terrified by the chaos around them. Bennett took down 3 attackers, then dragged them into the safe room Trenton had built for emergencies. The steel door sealed shut behind them, and at least Harold and Margaret were safe. But what about Rosalie? Trenton tore through the dark hallways, calling her name in raw desperation. He heard her scream from the direction of the kitchen and sprinted that way as fast as he could. When he reached it, his heart seemed to stop. Rosalie was surrounded by 4 or 5 men in black. She fought back, a kitchen knife clutched in her hand as she slashed toward them. But she was only an ordinary woman, no match for trained men. One tore the knife from her grip, another seized her by the hair and yanked her down to the floor. Trenton roared like a wounded animal and charged them. He shot one man, knocked a second unconscious with his fist, but the wound in his shoulder was draining him by the second. Blood was pouring out, and his head began to spin. One attacker struck the injured shoulder hard, and Trenton went down, collapsing to the floor in agony. Rosalie screamed his name when she saw him fall. She tried to break free and run to him, but the kidnappers held her tight and began dragging her toward the back. Trenton fought to rise, reaching for her, shouting her name with desperate force. Rosalie looked back at him one last time, her eyes shining with tears, but her voice still trying to stay strong. She screamed at him not to worry about her, to keep himself safe. Then the darkness swallowed her. She vanished through the back door with the kidnappers, leaving Trenton on the blood-soaked kitchen floor, his arms still stretched toward where she had been. Trenton tried to crawl up, tried to chase them, but his body wouldn't obey anymore. He'd lost too much blood. His strength was gone. He fell back onto the floor, his vision fading. The last thing he saw before he lost consciousness was Bennett's black shoes pounding toward him. Bennett dropped to his knees beside Trenton, hauled him up, and kept calling his name. He checked the wound on his boss's shoulder and let out a breath when he saw that despite the blood loss, it wasn't life-threatening. He told Trenton they'd taken her, they'd taken Rose. Trenton forced his eyes open, his mouth stammering that they had to save her. They had to find her. Bennett nodded and said he'd do everything he could. But first Trenton needed the wound bandaged. At that moment, the phone in Trenton's jacket pocket vibrated. Bennett pulled it out and looked at the screen. A message from an unknown number appeared, short and heavy with threat. 48 hours. We will contact you. Bennett showed it to Trenton. Trenton stared at the words, and the pain in his eyes hardened into hatred. He knew who was behind this, Franco Ricci. And maybe Veronica too. They had taken the person who mattered most to him, and they were going to pay dearly for it. Rosalie woke up in a room that was dark and damp with rot. Her head throbbed, probably from being knocked unconscious during the abduction. She tried to move, only to realize her hands were bound tightly behind her back with coarse rope that bit into her skin. She was sitting on an old wooden sofa, surrounded by stained concrete walls and piles of rotting wooden crates. It looked like an abandoned warehouse somewhere on the outskirts of the city. Weak light slipped through gaps in the rusted tin roof, just enough for Rosalie to make out two guards standing in a corner, their eyes never leaving her. Rosalie drew a deep breath and forced herself to stay calm. She'd survived worse than this. She'd been imprisoned before, treated like merchandise, stripped of dignity and freedom. Compared to what she endured 5 years ago, this wasn't the deepest circle of hell. She wouldn't let fear defeat her. Footsteps sounded outside, coming closer and closer. The rusty metal door groaned as it was pushed open. Rosalie lifted her head and saw a familiar figure step inside. Veronica Ashford. The woman looked nothing like the last time Rosalie had seen her. Gone were the expensive dresses and glittering jewelry. Veronica wore a black leather jacket, her hair pinned up neatly, her makeup light, but her eyes blazed with triumph. She walked up to Rosalie, folded her arms over her chest, and looked down at her with a contemptuous smile. She said, "Oh, look who's here, the loyal little house manager." Rosalie didn't answer. She only met Veronica's eyes with a calm, steady stare. The silence seemed to irritate Veronica. She pulled a sofa closer and sat across from Rosalie, tilting her head as if studying an animal in a cage. Veronica said, "You know, she'd offered Rosalie money once, enough for her to escape her pathetic, ordinary life. And yet she chose him. A cold-blooded mafia man instead of freedom and cash. Did she really think he would come save her? She was only a servant, replaceable at any time." Rosalie still didn't flinch under the cruelty. She looked straight at Veronica, her voice strangely calm. She said that no matter what happened to her, she didn't regret her choice. Not ever. Veronica gave a cold laugh and said she would regret it, because when Franco was finished with her, she would beg to die. Just then, the door opened again, and a man walked in. Franco Ricci. He wore a gray suit, a phone in his hand, his face flat and unreadable. 2 large men followed behind him. Franco stared at Rosalie for a long moment, as if searching his memory. Then he smiled, a smile that never reached his eyes. He said, "So this was the girl who testified against him 5 years ago. The girl who helped send many of his men to prison. He'd been looking for her for a very long time." Franco lifted the phone and began recording a video. He aimed the camera at Rosalie and spoke in a low, rough voice. He sent his greetings to Blackwell and said that 5 years ago, Trenton had taken something important from him. Now, he was taking it back. All of Trenton's business territory, in exchange for this girl. 48 hours. Franco turned the camera toward Rosalie and gestured for her to say something. Rosalie looked into the lens, knowing Trenton would see this video. She wanted to tell him she loved him, that she was grateful for everything he'd done for her, but instead she chose the words she knew were right. Her voice trembled slightly, but it held firm. She told Trenton not to give the man anything because of her. She wasn't worth the trade. Franco stopped recording and gave a mocking laugh. He said how touching, but he guessed Blackwell wouldn't see it that way. He sent the video, then turned and walked out with Veronica, leaving Rosalie alone in the darkness with 2 guards. Dozens of miles away, in the Blackwell mansion, as repairs continued after the attack, Trenton sat on his bed with his shoulder tightly bandaged. His phone vibrated with a new message. He opened it and saw a video. His heart seemed to stop when he saw Rosalie on the screen, hands tied, sitting in a dark room. He heard Franco's demand, heard Rosalie say she wasn't worth the exchange. His eyes turned bloodshot, his jaw clenched until it ached. His hand tightened around the phone until the screen began to crack under the pressure. She said she wasn't worth it. She didn't know that to him, she was more precious than the empire he'd spent his life building. Trenton sat alone in the pitch dark of his office. He'd turned off every light, leaving only the pale glow of his phone screen to wash over his face. The wound in his shoulder still throbbed, but that physical pain was nothing compared to what was tearing his heart apart. He watched the video Franco had sent again and again, over and over, until he could have recited every second, every moment by memory. Rosalie sat there with her hands bound, her face drained of color, yet her eyes still unbroken. Every time he heard her say not to give them anything because of her, that she wasn't worth the trade, Trenton's chest tightened, as if a hand were crushing the air out of him. She wasn't worth it. The girl who had quietly protected him for years wasn't worth it. The girl who had saved his life from the hands of a betraying wife wasn't worth it. The girl who had stayed beside him, cared for him, worried for him, and asked for nothing in return wasn't worth it. Trenton set the phone down and leaned back in his sofa, closing his eyes. In the darkness, images of Rosalie rose sharper than ever. Her smile when she brewed his coffee every morning, the look in her eyes when she listened to him talk about the weight of his work, the way she wore the bracelet he'd given her with such simple happiness, the way she looked at him as if he were her whole world. And suddenly, Trenton understood a truth he'd been denying for far too long. Rosalie wasn't just his house manager. She wasn't only the woman who had saved his life. She was the woman he loved. He didn't know when it had happened. Maybe it was during those evenings on the balcony, when they sat and talked, and the night air felt gentle for once. Maybe it was the moment she looked at him with such fear and concern when he discovered Veronica's betrayal. Maybe it had been long before that, and he'd simply been too blind to see it. And now she was in the hands of his enemy, possibly being tortured, possibly being killed at any moment. Because of him, because she had chosen to stand on his side. The office door opened and Bennett walked in with a grave expression. He switched on the light and saw his boss sitting like a stone statue, eyes bloodshot from sleeplessness and grief. Bennett came closer and spoke. He said his boss needed to understand something. If they handed over all their business territory to Franco, the empire his boss had spent years building would collapse completely. Hundreds of people who worked for them would lose their livelihoods. Partners would turn their backs. Enemies would tear apart what was left. Everything would vanish. Trenton stayed silent for a long time, staring into the empty space in front of him. Then he slowly lifted his head, and a hard, determined light flashed in his eyes, something Bennett had never seen before. He asked if Bennett truly thought he would let her die. An empire could be rebuilt. Money could be earned again. But Rosalie couldn't. He would not trade her life for anything in this world. He ordered Bennett to call everyone in. Tonight they would move. Bennett nodded and turned to leave, but Trenton called him back. His voice dropped, and there was something rare and soft inside it. He said that if anything happened to him tonight, Bennett had to make sure his parents were safe. Bennett looked back at his boss. Determination set into his face. He said nothing would happen to his boss. They would bring her home, both of them. Bennett walked out and closed the door behind him. Trenton picked up his phone and looked at Rosalie's image on the screen one last time. He lifted his hand and touched her face on the glass, whispering for her to wait for him. Rose, he was coming. Outside the mansion, Trenton Blackwell's men began to gather in the dark. Dozens of black vehicles filled the driveway. Men dressed in black moved quietly as they checked weapons and gear. Bennett stood in the center, assigning roles to each group. No one said much. Everyone understood this would be a long, dangerous night, but they were ready. For their boss, and for the woman their boss loved. The rescue had officially begun. In the hidden meeting room beneath the Blackwell estate, Trenton and Bennett bent over a large map spread across the table. Around them stood the most trusted men in the organization, all silent, waiting for orders. Trenton had traded his usual expensive suit for a fitted black outfit, and though his shoulder wound was tightly bandaged, he moved as if it didn't exist. Bennett worked at a laptop, the screen displaying tracking software crisscrossed with complex lines. Then, suddenly, a blinking red dot appeared on the map. Bennett exhaled in relief and said he'd found her. An abandoned warehouse on the south side of the city, about 20 minutes away by car. Trenton stared at the screen and felt a portion of the weight lift from his chest. The silver bracelet he'd given Rosalie 2 months earlier had done its job. The tiny tracking chip hidden inside was sending a steady signal, pinpointing her exact location. Giving her that bracelet that day had been the best decision he'd ever made. Bennett zoomed in and began analyzing the terrain around the warehouse. He pointed out the entryways, the spots where guards could be posted, the blind angles and the lines of sight. The plan took shape, detailed step by step. Trenton would send Franco a message, pretending to accept the deal, setting a meeting at the North Harbor. That would pull most of Franco's men away from the warehouse and create an opening for Trenton's team to strike. At the same time, Trenton had also contacted someone he knew in the FBI to report Franco's location. Franco would be arrested at the harbor on a list of charges from 5 years ago that were still prosecutable. 1 move, 2 targets. Meanwhile, in the abandoned warehouse dozens of miles away, Rosalie sat curled in the corner of the dark room. 2 guards still stood by the door, but they weren't paying attention to her anymore. Veronica had left long ago, maybe to rest, maybe to celebrate the victory she believed was coming. Franco hadn't appeared again since he recorded the video. The room sank into silence, broken only by the soft scurrying of rats, somewhere among the rotting wooden crates. Rosalie leaned her head against the cold wall, her eyes fixed on nothing. She didn't cry. She'd cried too much in the past, and now it felt as if she had no tears left. In the darkness, memories from 5 years earlier rose like a slow-motion reel. She remembered the dark room where she'd been held with other girls, remembered their hopeless eyes, remembered the terror and humiliation of being treated like merchandise. Then she remembered that fateful night, the crack of gunfire, the door being blown open, flashlight beams slicing through the dark, and she remembered the first man who stepped into that room, Trenton Blackwell. He didn't look at her with pity or disgust the way she'd feared. He looked at her like a human being. He took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders, his voice gentle as he told her she was safe now, that no one would ever hurt her again. It was the first time in months Rosalie felt she was being treated as a person instead of an object, and she had never forgotten it. In the darkness, Rosalie whispered that if this was the end, then at least she had lived. She'd had 5 years to be an ordinary person, to work in a warm home, to stand beside someone kind. She didn't regret anything. Suddenly, the ring of a phone shattered the stillness in the warehouse. One of the guards answered, listened for a moment, then nodded rapidly. He told the others the boss was calling. Blackwell had agreed to the exchange. They'd meet at the North Harbor within an hour. The boss ordered everyone to assemble. Rosalie heard Trenton's name, and her heart clenched. Had he agreed to give up everything for her? She didn't want that. She didn't want him to lose everything because of someone like her. When the guard finished the call, he turned to the others. They spoke quietly for a moment, then decided that only 2 men needed to stay behind to watch the girl. The rest would go to the harbor to support the boss. The girl was tied up anyway. She couldn't go anywhere. Rosalie watched most of the kidnappers leave, until only 2 guards remained by the door. She didn't know this was exactly what Trenton had planned. She didn't know Franco was walking straight into a trap, and she certainly didn't know that at that very moment, in the darkness outside the warehouse, Trenton Blackwell was standing there, eyes locked on the rusted metal door, ready to spill blood to bring her home. He wasn't at the harbor the way Franco believed. He was here, and he wouldn't leave without her. Trenton signaled his men to move in. In the darkness, the men dressed in black moved like ghosts, not a sound from their feet or their breath. They were trained for this, and they had done missions far more dangerous than this one. The abandoned warehouse lay silent ahead of them, only weak light leaking through gaps in the walls. 2 guards stood at the main entrance, smoking and talking idly, unaware that death was already close. The attack happened so fast the 2 guards didn't even understand what was happening. One of Trenton's men appeared from the shadows behind them and dropped the first with a brutal strike to the back of the neck. The second barely managed to turn his head before another man locked an arm around his throat and choked him unconscious. Both of them hit the ground, without a single cry. Trenton led the rescue team inside the warehouse. They split into small groups, swept every corner, and neutralized the remaining men with speed and precision. There were no gunshots, no screams, only exact punches and bodies folding to the floor. In less than 5 minutes, the warehouse was completely under their control. Bennett checked in over the radio with the team at the harbor and got good news. Franco Ricci had arrived at the meeting point with most of his men, but instead of meeting Trenton Blackwell the way he expected, he met dozens of FBI agents waiting for him. Franco realized he'd been played and tried to run, but it was too late. He was arrested along with more than 20 of his men, charged under the RICO Act for organized crime. The criminal empire he'd rebuilt over the past 5 years collapsed completely in a single night. Trenton had no time to celebrate. He had only one goal in his mind: find Rosalie. He charged down dark hallways, shoved open doors, peered into room after room. His heart hammered, the fear that he might be too late nearly driving him mad. Then he saw her. Rosalie sat on a sofa at the far end of the largest room, her hands still tied behind her back. The woman he loved was still alive. Trenton wanted to run to her at once, but his feet stopped short, because standing directly behind Rosalie was Veronica. The woman had appeared from nowhere. Maybe she'd been hiding in the warehouse when she heard the noise. And in her hand was a sharp knife pressed tight to Rosalie's throat. Veronica screamed at Trenton not to come any closer or she would kill the girl. Her face was twisted with panic and rage. Her eyes were bloodshot, her hair wild, and she looked like an animal driven into a corner. Trenton stopped and slowly raised both hands to show he wasn't armed. He fought to keep his voice calm as he told Veronica to let her go, that it was over. Franco had been arrested. His men had been arrested. She had no one left to protect her now. Put the knife down, and it would be easier for her. Veronica shook her head wildly and screamed no. She wouldn't lose. Not like this. She'd lost everything because of Trenton and that hateful servant girl. She wouldn't go down without taking someone with her. The blade pressed deeper into Rosalie's neck, and a small bead of blood began to seep out. Trenton felt his heart squeeze tight at the sight of that drop. He couldn't let Rosalie be hurt again. He had to do something. But before he could move, Rosalie saved herself. The girl everyone thought was fragile suddenly slammed her head backward. The back of her skull struck Veronica's nose with a dry, cracking sound. Veronica screamed in pain, instinctively letting go of the knife to clutch her face. The knife clattered to the floor. Rosalie rolled quickly to the side, scrambling out of Veronica's reach. Veronica dropped to the ground, both hands over her face, blood streaming from a broken nose. She sobbed and shrieked like a child whose favorite toy had been snatched away. Rosalie got to her feet and looked back at the woman writhing on the dirty floor. Her voice was calm, but it was cold. She said Veronica had lost the moment she chose the wrong path. Bennett rushed in from behind, restrained Veronica in seconds, and snapped handcuffs around her wrists. The woman who had once been beautiful and proud now lay on the filthy warehouse floor, her face smeared with blood and tears, her mouth still screaming curses. Trenton didn't spare Veronica another glance. He ran to Rosalie, used the knife Veronica had dropped to cut through the rope binding her wrists. Then he pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he were afraid that if he let go, she would vanish. Rosalie pressed her face to his chest, her body trembling, but she didn't cry. She only stood there and let him hold her, feeling the warmth of him, feeling the hard, racing beat of his heart. She was safe. He had come, just as she had always believed he would. Trenton didn't want to let Rosalie go, but he knew he had to check whether she'd been seriously hurt anywhere. He loosened his arms gently and looked her over from head to toe. Her face was pale, bruises blooming on her cheek and forehead. Her wrists reddened where the rope had bitten tight. A small cut at her throat still seeped blood. Not deep, but the sight of it still sent a sharp ache through his chest. He slipped off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders, his voice trembling with emotion. He asked if she was all right, then kept apologizing, again and again, for not getting there sooner. If he'd been a little faster, she wouldn't have had to endure this. If he'd been more careful, Veronica and Franco would never have been able to take her. It was all his fault. Rosalie shook her head, her eyes blurring with tears. She said he shouldn't have come. It was too dangerous. If anything had happened to him, she would never have forgiven herself. She paused, her voice shrinking as if she were trying to hold back something she'd buried deep inside for a long time. She said she was afraid. Trenton frowned and asked what she was afraid of. Rosalie lifted her eyes to his, tears spilling over. She said she was afraid that one day he'd realize she didn't belong in his world. She was just an ordinary woman, with no family, no past she could be proud of, nothing but scars inside her soul. He was Trenton Blackwell, powerful and wealthy, and she was only a servant he'd rescued out of pity. She didn't deserve to stand beside him. Sooner or later he would see it, and she would be abandoned again. Trenton felt his heart tighten until it hurt. He lifted a hand and tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. He told her she belonged anywhere she wanted, and he wanted that place to have him in it. Rosalie started to speak, but Trenton pressed a finger to her lips, stopping her. He told her that tonight he'd almost lost her. When he watched the video Franco sent, when he heard her say she wasn't worth trading for, he realized something he should have understood long ago. She wasn't his house manager. She wasn't someone he'd saved out of pity. She was the person he wanted to protect for the rest of his life. She was the person he loved. Rosalie broke into sobs at those words. She couldn't believe that this powerful, cold man could say something like that. She had loved him for a long time, but she'd kept it locked inside because she believed she didn't deserve it. She'd always thought he saw her only as an employee, someone he'd rescued and felt responsible for, but it turned out he loved her too. Trenton lifted his hand and wiped the tears sliding down her cheeks, his touch gentle, tender. He told her to come home with him, not as an employee, just as herself. Rosalie Harper, the woman he loved. Rosalie searched Trenton's eyes for any sign that he was lying, or that he was only pitying her. But she saw nothing except honesty and love. He looked at her as if she were his whole world, and maybe, for him, she truly was. She nodded, tears still falling, but they weren't the tears of pain or fear anymore. They were tears of happiness. For the first time in her life, she felt she truly belonged somewhere, belonged to someone. Trenton smiled, the first real smile he'd worn in days of tension and dread. He bent down and gently kissed her forehead. Then he pulled her into his arms again. This time not because he was afraid of losing her, but because he wanted to be close to her. From a distance, Bennett watched them, a small smile forming on his lips. After 10 years of working for Trenton Blackwell, he was finally seeing his boss find real happiness. In the days after that fateful rescue night, justice was finally carried out. News of Franco Ricci's arrest flooded the newspapers and television broadcasts across Chicago. The Mafia boss who had once been infamous was now in FBI custody under the RICO Act for organized crime. The list of charges against him was as long as a novel, including human trafficking, extortion, money laundering, kidnapping, and a string of other crimes he'd committed over the course of many years. The criminal empire Franco had labored to build collapsed completely in a single night. His men were either arrested or scattered in every direction like an anthill split open. The man who had sworn he'd take revenge on Trenton Blackwell now faced life in a federal prison. Derek Lawson didn't escape justice either. The Illinois State Bar convened an emergency session and decided to permanently revoke his license after receiving full evidence of the illegal acts he'd committed. And it didn't stop there. Police also charged him as an accomplice in fraud and conspiracy to commit murder. Derek was arrested in the cheap apartment where he was hiding, his face drained of color as he was handcuffed and pushed into a police car. His expected sentence was 10 to 15 years, enough time to sit with the weight of his choices. But the most unforgettable scene unfolded on the morning Veronica Ashford was led out of the police station to be transferred to federal prison. Trenton and Rosalie stood outside, not to gloat over her downfall, but to watch the final chapter of that nightmare close. Veronica stepped out beneath the harsh sunlight, her hands cuffed in front of her, dressed in an orange inmate uniform. The face that had once been beautiful and alluring now looked worn and empty. Her broken nose was still bruised, her eyes ringed dark from nights without sleep. She seemed to have aged a decade, in only a few days behind bars. The charges Veronica faced included conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, and aiding and abetting kidnapping. Her total expected sentence was 18 to 25 years in federal prison. As Veronica was escorted past where Trenton and Rosalie stood, she suddenly stopped. The officer tried to pull her along, but Veronica struggled, twisting to look back at them one last time. Her eyes were wet and red, full of bitterness and fury. She demanded to know why. Why that servant girl got everything while she was left with nothing. She was prettier, smarter, more calculating. And yet in the end, she lost it all, while Rosalie stood beside Trenton like a queen. Rosalie looked at Veronica with a calm gaze, with no gloating and no contempt. She said it was because she'd never tried to steal what wasn't hers. Veronica broke into sobs at the answer. She fought, screamed, spat curses, while 2 officers struggled to force her into the car. The door slammed shut, cutting off the wild, frantic cries. The police car rolled away slowly, carrying Veronica Ashford toward the place where she'd pay for every sin she'd committed. Just then, a familiar car pulled up hard in front of the station gates. Harold and Margaret Blackwell stepped out, their faces tight with worry. The moment Margaret saw Rosalie, she ran to her and wrapped her in a fierce embrace, sobbing. She thanked God Rosalie was safe, said they'd been terrified when they heard she'd been kidnapped. Harold stood beside them and laid a hand on Rosalie's shoulder, his eyes gentle, as if he were looking at a daughter of his own. Margaret let Rosalie go, wiped her tears, then took Rosalie's hands and held them tightly. She said that from now on, Rosalie was family, and she mustn't ever forget it. Rosalie was so moved she couldn't speak. She only nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. The orphaned girl who had once been sold like merchandise now had a real family. The police car carrying Veronica disappeared at the end of the road. Trenton stood beside Rosalie and gently took her hand. He told her it was over now. Rosalie squeezed his hand and lifted her face to the clear blue Chicago sky. For the first time in a long time, she felt light. The darkness had passed, and the light was waiting ahead. 6 months had passed since the day Veronica was taken to federal prison. Life at the Blackwell estate had changed completely, in a way no one could have predicted. Trenton and Rosalie didn't rush, and they didn't force anything. They let their feelings grow in the most natural way, learning how to love each other through the smallest details of everyday life. Rosalie no longer slept in the staff room downstairs. She moved up to the main floor, into the bedroom right beside Trenton's. Every morning, they ate breakfast together and talked about their plans for the day. Every evening, they sat on the balcony, watched the sunset, and shared the deepest thoughts they'd kept hidden for so long. Trenton taught Rosalie how to drive, how to manage personal finances, how to walk with confidence in a world of powerful people. And Rosalie taught him how to feel happiness in simple things, how to love without calculating, how to trust without fear. Harold and Margaret visited the estate often, usually every weekend. They had officially come to see Rosalie as their own daughter. Margaret liked taking Rosalie shopping, teaching her to cook the traditional dishes of the Blackwell family. Harold told her stories about his younger years, about how he met and fell in love with Margaret, about the values he wanted to pass down to the next generation. Rosalie listened with bright eyes. She'd never had a real family, and now she was finally living inside that kind of warmth. One autumn evening, when the leaves had begun to turn a vivid gold and orange, Trenton led Rosalie up to the rooftop of the mansion. It was where they often sat and talked, the place that had witnessed so many beautiful moments between them over the past 6 months. Tonight, the rooftop was decorated with hundreds of small candles, glowing softly. The lights of Chicago glittered in the distance like a diamond carpet stretching to the horizon. A gentle wind moved through the air, carrying the scent of roses from the garden below. Trenton took Rosalie's hand and led her to the center of the rooftop. Her heart pounded because she could feel something special was about to happen. Trenton looked into her eyes, his voice warm and heavy with emotion. He said he'd been waiting a long time for the right moment to say this. Then he slowly went down on one knee, pulling a small black velvet box from his pocket. He opened it, revealing a diamond ring, simple but elegant, sparkling in the candlelight. Trenton said Rosalie had given him a second chance at life. She had taught him what true loyalty was, what sincere love looked like. Before he met her, he thought he understood love, but he realized he'd known nothing at all. She had opened an entirely new world for him. He asked if she would walk with him for the rest of this life. Rosalie cried, her hands trembling as she covered her mouth. She said she used to believe her life had ended the day she was kidnapped 5 years ago. She used to believe she would never deserve happiness, never deserve to be loved. But he had given her a reason to keep living. He had shown her that the past didn't define the future. She nodded again and again, her voice breaking as she said yes. Trenton smiled and gently slid the ring onto Rosalie's ring finger. Then he stood and held her tight. They stood there among hundreds of flickering candles, under a star-filled night sky, living the happiest moment of their lives. 3 months later, the wedding of Trenton Blackwell and Rosalie Harper was held in the garden of the estate. It was a simple, intimate ceremony, attended only by family and the people closest to them. Rosalie wore a pure white wedding dress and carried a bouquet of deep red roses. She walked down a carpet of flowers with Harold at her side, and Harold had volunteered to play the role of the father who would give her away to Trenton. Margaret sat in the front row, crying tears of joy as she watched her son finally find true love. The girl who had once been sold like merchandise now stood beside the most powerful man in Chicago, not for money, not for power, but for sincere love and absolute loyalty. Harold stood, raised a glass of champagne, and offered a toast to Trenton and Rose. He wished that their love story would inspire everyone who heard it. Bennett stood in the corner, quietly watching with a smile on his face. After 10 years of working for Trenton Blackwell, It was the first time he'd ever seen his boss truly happy. Sometimes darkness doesn't exist to swallow us. It exists to help us find our own light. Trenton and Rosalie's story was the clearest proof of that. They had walked through hell, faced betrayal and danger, but in the end they found each other and found happiness. This story offers us many valuable lessons about life. First, loyalty and sincerity always defeat deception and greed. Veronica had beauty, intelligence, and the ability to calculate, but in the end, she still lost everything because she chose the wrong path. Meanwhile, Rosalie had only a sincere heart and gratitude, yet she gained everything. Second, the past doesn't define your future. Rosalie had once been a victim of crime, had once believed she didn't deserve happiness, but she overcame it and wrote a brighter chapter for her life. Third, true love doesn't come from money or status. It comes from understanding and mutual respect. If you feel this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and share this video with your friends and loved ones to spread this meaningful message. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the touching stories every day. How do you feel about this story? Have you ever met people like Veronica in real life? Or are you lucky enough to have people like Rosalie by your side? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd really love to hear what's deep in your heart. Thank you for watching this video all the way to the end. We wish you and your family good health, a joyful life, and peace each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.